Hello, friends. How are you? It's been a week since we spoke to each other. At least I spoke, and I hope you listened. And I'm glad to see you again. Today I want to continue my story, and we're kind of starting a new chapter. After the death of my grandfather, life in the ghetto went along its normal pace, and to be very honest about it, I have a very, very little recollection of what really was going on, except I recall rumors. People were talking about that the young men were organizing in town, in the ghetto, trying to get some weapons to organize a resistance. Then the rumors were spreading that the Judenrat, the Jewish Central Committee for the town, ran away, left the ghetto, and went into the partisans. And then that was basically what was going on until the 30th of April, 1942. We got up that morning and we were told we must gather on this place of the old cemetery, which was in the center of the ghetto. And unless we are there and we will be found not being there, we will be killed on the spot. So all of us from our house got together and we walked to the cemetery. Once we walked into the cemetery, there was no way out. It was surrounded from all sides by soldiers. As far as I can recall, I remember only German soldiers. Although I realized later on there were also White Russian militia who worked together with the German soldiers. We were standing on the cemetery. Everybody was afraid, not knowing what was going to happen next, until we were told to march in the direction of the center of the town toward the highway leading to the town of Navarodok. And so we were going out in this direction. As I was approaching with all the other people, in the mess, you can realize yourself a mess of people from all sides being pushed into a narrow passageway. And on the way out of the cemetery, all of a sudden, I was pulled backwards and I heard a shot, and I saw in front of me a young man was killed. All I remember is seeing his face turning totally black and a puff of smoke coming out from the rifle. And next to me was another man who was with us in our house. I recall his name was Itche, Reb Itche, we used to call him, Herr Itche. He was from a town called Jaludok, and he was a friend of my uncle and aunt. And when our ghetto was opened up, he moved into our ghetto, in our house, and we lived together. And all of a sudden, he was hit over the head with a truncheon, and his head was beginning to bleed all over his face. And that's all I remember. And I was pulled in, and we kept on going on the way out of the cemetery toward the streets of the town in the direction of Navarodok. And we were walking on the road out of the town, out to the outskirts of the city. There were people lining up on all directions, looking at us, and we were going, being led by flanks of soldiers, leading us forward. We were led out, I cannot recall whether 2 miles or half a mile out of town, and we were told to sit down in the ditch on the left side of the road. And all the soldiers were standing on the right side of the road. The soldiers were standing shoulder to shoulder. There was a huge amount of soldiers. And as we were sitting down, I remember, 2 young boys began to run. They were running in the direction on the left side of the road into a little forest further down. There was some kind of a meadow, and they were running on the meadow. No sooner had they run, I would imagine, 200 feet, where all the soldiers fired at them, and both of them fell, one after the other, and there they remained lying. We were all panicked and frightened, and we remained sitting in the ditch, waiting for what was going to happen next. As we were sitting in the ditch, the soldiers came up. They would take in front of us a group of 10 people or 12 people, and they would lead them ahead down the road into a small forest that was ahead of the road. The forest was on the left side of the road, and a few minutes later, as the people walked into the forest, we would hear shots, and the soldiers would come and take another group of people. And so it was going on for a while, and the people in front began to move backwards and trying to be, so to speak, avoiding being led and being caught up in front. And many of the people began to throw away their passports or ID cards in disappointment and disillusionment. I was sitting there with my mother in front of me. Actually, behind me, I was in front of her, my uncle and my two little sisters. And I remember my uncle said, "We're not moving, we're staying here, what will be, we're not budging." As other people kept on pushing by us, I looked up at my mother. My mother was crying, and she said to me, "My child, cry, God will save you." I realized what she was saying, but my reaction was, I was totally petrified, and I had no emotions in me. I felt like a rock. But I saw my mother's face tearing, and she was holding my baby brother in her arms and cuddling him and crying. And sooner or later, at this point, a car with German officers drove up, took up a position in front of us, and suddenly we saw they were stopping every group of people that was being led toward the little forest. They would control their papers. And some people were motioned to go to the right of the road, a little bit of a hill up, and they were left standing without a guard. And the others were led forward, and as the routine was, they were shot. And the soldiers would come back and take another 10 people or another 12 people, lead them up. The soldiers, the officers would stop them, control the papers. Some were motioned on to go straight. The others were motioned to go on the right. Those on the right were standing on their own without a guard. Those who were led forward were shot because we heard the shots coming from the little forest. As our turn came, as I mentioned, my uncle said, "We're not moving anymore. What will be, will be. We're standing. When our turn comes, we'll go." Our turn came, and it was prearranged that my mother was going to identify as the wife of my uncle because she had no documents of employment, and my aunt was going to be on her own as with her ID as a teacher in the school of seamstresses, and therefore hopefully finding that she's engaged, she would be saved. And my uncle, having worked in a sawmill, would be identified as a useful worker, and he would take along my mother as his wife and us as children. And so the idea would be all of us would be identified as one family and hopefully be saved. As we approached the little checkpoint of officers, we kind of got confused, and my aunt was motioned on to go forward, and we were supposed to be moving to the right side, my uncle, we, his children. And at that point, my uncle realized that his wife was going to be sent to be killed. He reached out and said, "It's my wife," and grabbed her back. And my mother was pushed forward, and she kept on going straight holding my baby brother, and we were moved to the right. We walked up the little hill, and my mother walked away with another 7 or 8 people. And I could remember the back. She was walking straight as she disappeared into the bushes. And then the shots came out, were heard. And that was the end, the last time I saw my mother. And this was going on for some time until all the people went through this process. Some were sent to us, others were sent directly forward, and they were all killed. They were killed in front of pre-dug graves. It was a mass grave which was dug ahead of time. And all of the people were shot there. Some were shoved in alive. Some died before they fell in, and some fainted and fell in, and that was the end of it. We were then motioned to go back to town. As we walked back to town, the people of the town were lined up on the streets, watching and looking at us, and we walked desolate and desperate back to our homes. As we came into the ghetto, we were told we have to move from our house because the ghetto was now made smaller, and we had to move at the same evening into another house. And that was the end of it. After that, a new chapter began. We were left without a father, without a mother, my 2 sisters and I, and the care of my uncle and my aunt. And we began a new life. I remember personally, I felt so motionless, emotionless, and cold, but isolated and alone. And so we began a new chapter the following night in a strange house with strange people, hoping for a better tomorrow, which never came. See you next week. God bless you.